Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar, English Australia's webinar on quarterly ELICOS market insights based on Q4 results. I'm Brett Blacker, the CEO of English Australia, and it's my pleasure to be presenting this afternoon's webinar with Svetlana Cruz, the Senior Research Manager for our partner Bonard. Today, we'll be presenting the results from the Q4 ELICOS Market Insight Survey, and as well as other key data from recently reported data sources from the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, as well as Department of Home Affairs. Before presenting today's webinar, I do want to provide a special thanks to all of the colleges that participated in this survey round. We had a record number of participants each time. We've certainly had great feedback, and we know that the survey results have been valuable as highlighted by your participation, with a record 115 colleges providing their support for this round. It has helped in our efforts to understand the impact of the sector through this COVID-19 experience, and specifically helped us to lobby on your support for you as well. So moving on, I would like to particularly thank the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, who have provided their funding support for this research over the past year, enabling us to provide the data services, the research services and the insights to all of you and the sector at no cost. And we specifically do want to acknowledge colleagues from the International Research and Analysis Unit, Steve Nerlich and the team, who have also provided additional support along the way. So thank you to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. I would also like to acknowledge our research partner, Bonard, noting Svetlana's here today presenting with me. Many of you would have had contact with Svetlana as we've undertaken this research, but the team across Bonard are incredibly professional and one of the leaders globally in market research in the international education student community. So thank you for your ongoing efforts, our research partner for this and a number of other key topics of research. And lastly, I would like to thank our partner for this webinar series, Allianz Global Assistance, who have provided their support as a long-standing partner for market intelligence and research projects undertaken by English Australia. And so very special thanks to our colleagues from Allianz Global Assistance. So as a quick overview for today's session, what we aim to cover is the December 2020 student visa data around student commencements and enrolments, first of all, just to set the scene. As we know, across the ELICOS sector, we're unique in terms of having the non-student visa cohort, and so our data series will aim to give a true representation based on the sample group of providers that responded to the survey. We'll have much more in-depth review. For colleagues that participated in the survey, tonight you will receive your copy of the report, the insight report tables, as well as the pivot table to allow you to undertake your own analysis. But what we aim to do today is to give some more in-depth analysis of the research itself. So thank you for participating and thank you for joining today. What we will do is round out the session with some of the more future-looking metrics, and particularly around the December 2020 student visa data, focusing on the lodgements and grants, and specifically looking at the ELICOS sector. For anyone that's just recently joined, just noting that we do have the video enabled today, audio isn't enabled, and we are recording today's session. It's your choice to keep your video on or turn it off as you wish. Moving into the data itself and covering off the first topic around the September 2020 data, English Australia will tomorrow send out our monthly market report, and we'll have more analysis again on what happened as the December 2020 student visa performance, and particularly pick up on performance across the ELICOS sector. But today we just wanted to highlight of what many of you may have seen released in just the last couple of days, overall sector performance for 2020. So international education has obviously been significantly impacted due to the border closures over this past year. The end of year result in terms of student visa commencements ended with a negative 7.3% in overall commencements. And looking at the graphs, you can see higher education in terms of its enrolments had a decline of 5.1%. Of this period, and due namely to the onshore growth, the number of students in the onshore vocational education market continuing to study, we actually saw a small increase, or actually a 9% increase in VET enrolments as at 2020. The ELICOS sector, we experienced a decline of 33% in our enrolment number, and that was equivalent to the other sector as well, which is namely non-award study abroad and foundation program. And the school sector was just under 20% decline in enrolments. Now, we are all aware that that enrolment number was largely impacted by those students onshore in Australia that continued to study and necessarily didn't return home during that period. In the commencement, December 2020 commencement period, what we saw was all sectors declined. We had an aggregate all sector decline of just under 22%. In that, the vocational sector up until December was showing a small proportion of growth, as at the end of the year it had 0.2% decline. But the actual number of commencements in this last year, vocational education, actually overshadowed higher education. So there was some 168,000 commencements in vocational education training, compared with 136,000 commencements in higher education. So VET with a small decline, 0.2%, higher education down 23%. ELICOS, again with our other or non-award category, experienced the most significant decline, both over 43%, and with ELICOS, our numbers declined from 117,000 student visas in 2019 down to 66,500 visas in 2020. That number itself, looking back, takes us to a period back over 15 years now, until we had a market performance that low. And so I guess you can consider where we've come and all of those years of growth in the sector over the last 15 years, we've essentially rewound in terms of the actual number of commencing numbers, which is obviously an incredibly difficult period. Now, in this data set, I do want to preface this is what is recorded on the ELICOS database. So for any of your student enrolments or student commencements that is recorded in PRISMs, the data that's shown here is the Department of Education, Skills and Employment published data, which comes out of the PRISM system. So if it's been a student that's commenced online or offshore, but it's been concluded as a commencement, it will be in this data, but it's only for the international student visa holders in that data set. So just to qualify who is represented in this data. Now, as I said, in schools, just to round it off, schools had a 31% decline. Now, moving into our performance for ELICOS sector, I think we've just pulled out, particularly in the last quarter, the performance in the last quarter, which we ended the end of year result, as I mentioned. So student visas, student visa commencement ended 43% down at the end of 2020. But when you look at that month-on-month comparison, what's being experienced in colleges in that month-on-month comparison, December alone experienced a 76% decline. And yeah, you can see on the slide, you know, that was the worst decline, in fact, in terms of a comparative decline that's been experienced across the entire year. Of those, if we look at it in terms of a nationality perspective, and particularly looking at the top 10 nationalities, within all of the 155 different countries or nationalities that are represented in student visa commencements, 47% of that came within the top 3 source countries. So we still had those dominant China, Brazil, Colombia, with 47% of the market. And in the top 10, which is represented on the screen here now, essentially that contributed to 3/4 of the entire market. So 75% of all of our commencements came from those particular markets which are represented on the screen now. As you can see, in terms of the top 5 for us, we had China with a declining rate. China down over 50%, and so dropping from 29,467 down to 14,681. Very significant impact, particularly across university centre providers, which had a large concentration with the China market. Colombia experienced 24% decline in as number 2 in market share, and still representing about 15% of market share. And then Brazil, unfortunately, a lot of the growth that we'd seen certainly year on year over recent years was taken away in 2020, with Brazil experiencing a 48% decline, almost 49% decline as well. But across all of those top 10 markets and indeed the top 15 markets in both enrolments and commencements, there was a decline, and most of those well above 20%, a lot of them over 40 and 50% declines in student visa commencements as at 2020. Just moving on in terms of that picture again, by state, we had essentially WA was the only state, West Australia was the only state to experience a decline which was less than 40% over that past year. Tasmania and ACT dropping over 50%, and obviously with I guess ELICOS numbers essentially returning to levels, as I mentioned, back to 2005, with the total numbers. Quite a scary situation, and something that, I think in terms of the way in which we're able to demonstrate the impact that this last year has had, if we're essentially going back 15 years in terms of a commencing student cohort. Colleagues, I just want to let you know that anyone that's joined, again, we have video enabled and the audio is off, and we are recording today's session, and your choice to keep your video on or off. I'm now going to move on in the presentation and hand over to Svetlana, my colleague from Bonnard, and we're going to move away from the Department of Education student visa data and specifically look at the results from the Q4 survey. And noting that the metrics that we use in the survey is around a count. So we do look at the student number. So it's not a commencement or enrollment, it's the actual number of students that we had studying with our providers during these discrete periods. In the presentation today, we will give some aggregate analysis, and we will give some specific data which was in comparison to the other quarters. But the majority of what will be presented today will be what was captured as part of this survey for the student numbers across the October, November, December period, so that Q4 from the survey respondents. But just on that, I'd like to now hand over to Svetlana to provide the analysis of Q4. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett, for the kind introduction. So as Brett mentioned, I will be providing an overview of the Q4 2020 results. So just a brief introduction of the scheme itself. So highlighting the importance of the scheme is, of course, the timely market performance data. So we have been providing this quarterly reports for the sector itself, featuring the trend data for benchmarking of the industry. And one of the unique features of this is, of course, the comprehensive data, which is on providing numbers for all students, regardless of visa status. So we have been taking note of visa across the board, with a student visa and with visitor visa and working holiday and other visa holders. So moving on, we have been committed to providing new areas and insights. So apart from the annual report, we have been providing the seasonalities and booking sources and course delivery methods for the quarterly report itself. And of course, the research sample itself is across both members and non-members for ELICOS providers. So this is the quarterly reports itself as a background. So diving straight into the Q4 2020 data, as Brett mentioned. So first of all, I would also like to thank again the 115 participating colleges who have been taking the time, who actually provide all of their data for the quarterly reports. And 115 of these participating colleges were provided 109 both of Q4 2020 and 2019 data. And in terms of representation, the respondents across the states has been stable, with Queensland and New South Wales both strongly represented for Q4 2020. Looking at the sector representation, so similarly to the state breakdown, provider representation is consistent. So we have standalone colleges remaining as the biggest cohort of participants with 40 colleges. And this is followed by the university-based centers at 31 respondents, and with vocational educational training for 20 participants, 9 from multi-sector, 6 from school-based providers, and 3 from private higher education. So given that this is actually the last quarter for 2020, as Brett mentioned, I will be providing a summary of the Q1 and Q4 data itself, but diving into the market itself, Q4 2020 remains to have a steep decline of student numbers. Colleges reported a total of 7,987 versus 25,245 in 2019. So this represents a decrease of 68.4% for Q4. So that's for October to December data. And for student weeks, the sector faced a much steeper decline at 72%. In terms of visa breakdown, student visa composed the majority share of student numbers at 76%. On the other hand, visitor visa is naturally down. So looking at the whole year share of visitor visa, it started with 19% share for Q1, then it was down to 2% at Q2, and then for Q3 and Q4 to 1%. And this, of course, this trend reflects as well with the student weeks, with student visa holders having the majority share at 76%. For students by booking source, so we have been seeing the increasing trend of direct bookings since Q2. So for Q2, we had a 14% direct bookings, and it continually increased to Q3 and Q4. So for Q4, we have now at 20%. But as we can see here, the role of agents is still consistent. It has still been important, and and we are seeing this much in the future. Looking at instruction methods, so data shows how schools are adapting to the circumstances. So majority of students have been in online classes for 52% of the share, while 38% have attended in person or face-to-face, and 11% on blended learning. For study location, and I'm going to be presenting this as well to the other quarters, but we can see here the significant increase of share from offshore students, with more than 3,960 students undertaking their courses outside Australia, which accounts for 50% of students for Q4 2020. And I would like to take note that this is based on the 97 providers who were able to provide a breakdown of their students' study location. So providing you a quick recap for the performance of the sector from Q1 to Q4. Looking back at the number of participating colleges, so we can see here the increasing number of participants at the latter end of the year, and it shows not only the validity of the scheme, but also the increasing need of a much needed timely data both for the sector's needs and decision-making of colleges. So we started strongly with 104 participating colleges, and we have seen a stronger participation rate at Q3 with 112, and eventually have the highest rate for Q4 at 150. So once again, I would like to thank all those colleges who have submitted their data and actually took the time to provide their quarterly data to us. For total student numbers, so providing a summary of Q1 to Q4, showing the trends and seasonality of the sector. So based on, I would like to note that this is based on different samples throughout the year, as previously mentioned. So we can see here that the year started with a 9.5% decline, and then it was obviously had a dip at 55.6% at Q2, and then later on had the steepest decline at 17.8 at Q3. So you can see here that the Q3 has been the hardest hit quarter for the sector. And then we can see that it continued to the Q4 with a 68.4%. And the student weeks actually reflected the same trend. So Q1 started stable with a decrease of 9.4%, had a dip at 62.4% at Q2, and then had a much steep decline at 73.7% at Q3. And then for Q4, a 72.3% drop. In terms of comparing the research sample across the board, so as we can see here, the numbers shown are actually based on 79 providers participated throughout all the quarters. So when looking at the trend development and on a core sample, so we have captured here all the students under all visa types, so both students and non-student visa type. And you can see here the difference from the DESA data provided by Brett earlier. And we can see here the like-to-like comparison of data, and it shows that there is an overall decrease of 47% in student numbers for 2020, and which provides you another perspective on the performance of the sector for 2020. For the summary of students by study location, so this is a very interesting development for the sector, as we can see here. One of the highlight, of course, and feature of the scheme itself is capturing both onshore and offshore students. So from Q1, we can see here that it started with 1% or 424 students studying offshore, and then eventually showed the gradual increase of students studying outside Australia. And so from Q2, we can see here increasing 20% with around 1,500 students, to Q3 to 34%. And then eventually for Q4, half of the share has been increased into 50% for offshore students. And going back into the Q4 2020 data itself, in state overview, results showed that South Australia having the smallest decline in terms of quarter-on-quarter change at 51%, followed by Western Australia at 52.5%. For Victoria and Queensland, they both faced the biggest drop, with Victoria having 74% drop and Queensland down to 73%. New South Wales, on the other hand, saw the steepest decline. So in terms of absolute numbers, it actually had a more than 6,300 less students, or a decline of 67%. And student weeks reflect the same trend with the student numbers. South Australia had the smallest decline at 46%. It was followed by Western Australia to 56%, and with Victoria, Queensland having the biggest quarter-on-quarter change with 78% and 70% decrease respectively, and with New South Wales down to 75%. So going through quickly on each state, going to start with New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. So for New South Wales, there has been a little changes in the market in terms of the top 10 source countries throughout the year. China remains the top source country for New South Wales with a 47% decline. And if we compare this to the Q4 2019 and Q4 2020, so Brazil maintained its position as the second source country, however, with a decline of 78%. And this is followed by Colombia with 160 students, wherein it was down to 65%. Japan, on the other hand, we have been seeing a decrease with Japan as a source market. So from third in Q4 2019, it had a decrease of 81% for Q4 2020. So now it's on it serves as the fourth top source country for New South Wales. And looking at the top source countries itself, all experienced more than 60% decrease, except for China with, as mentioned, 47%, and Chile at 55% decrease. For the analysis of largest increases and decreases, so I will be focusing on the latter, given the significant decreases in numbers for source countries. New South Wales, largest decreases were all top source countries. So we can see here Brazil, China, Japan, South Korea, and Colombia. And as mentioned earlier, Brazil had actually the largest decrease in terms of with less than 697 students for Q4 2020. And this is followed by China at 693. Moving on to Queensland and the Northern Territory, we can see that Japan, from being the top source country for Q4 2019, has dropped into the third spot for Q4 2020 with a steep decline of 89%. So when we look into Japan in detail, we can see the drop, which is stemming out from the decrease of students enrolled under visitor visa in 2019, Q4 2019, which is accounted for 1,021 students, or composing the 97% in Q4 2019 for Japan. For other countries, China, with its relatively small decrease of 114 students, is now the top source country for Q4 2020 in Queensland. And in terms of quarter-on-quarter change, Spain had the biggest decrease with a drop of 93% in Q4 2020. Again, for the largest decrease in Queensland, Japan had naturally it's naturally on the top spot now with 1,335 less students, and this is followed by Brazil, Spain, and South Korea, which is 4 of these are in the top 10 source countries of Queensland. For South Australia, the figures are obviously smaller, but China remains its most important source market, though with a decrease of 39%. So Saudi Arabia remains to be the second source market for South Australia, although far behind from China. As we can see here, Saudi Arabia is 28 for 2020, Q4 2020, and 60 for 2019. On the other hand, Hong Kong and Oman increased But looking into absolute numbers, these are actually relatively small increases for the quarter. For the largest decline, as mentioned earlier, it is naturally that the top source countries were also to be found most affected with decreases in student numbers. So China had the largest decrease, for South Australia, and followed by Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Vietnam, and Japan. Looking into Victoria and Tasmania, China is also the top source country for this state, but also had the biggest decrease in terms of absolute numbers. So from 2,745 students in Q4 2019 to 993 students in Q4 2020. And China is followed by Colombia, however, having a steep decline at 78% for Colombia. In terms of quarter-on-quarter change, Japan had the biggest drop at 88%, or 43 students from 372 in Q4 2019. For the largest decrease of analysis, China is not surprisingly on the top, which is down to 64%. And then it was followed by Colombia, as mentioned before, at 78%, Japan down to 88%, and Thailand to 87%, and Saudi Arabia with 79%. Lastly, looking into Western Australia, so it is noteworthy that it is the only state with Colombia as a top source country. So Colombia, with from its third spot in Q4 2019, it actually replaced China from the top spot. And it actually only had a 8% decrease for Q4 2020. So this is actually relatively small compared to the decreases in other states of Colombia. On the other hand, Taiwan was the only country with a 15% increase for Q4 2020. So from 61 in 2019, it was up to 70 students in 2020. Well, in terms of steepest decline, Japan recorded an 80% drop with 48 students in Q4 2020 from 246 in 2019. And when we look at Japan at the largest decreases, so we can see here that it dropped to 80% for 2020. And then it was followed by China at 51, Brazil with 46%, and Switzerland from 93 to 0 students, and then France with 76% decrease. So shifting to the provider type analysis, moving on to the ELICOS as standalone ELICOS colleges. So we can see here the numbers from the biggest cohort of respondents, so 40 reporting colleges. And this shows that the most affected in terms of absolute numbers, both in student numbers and student weeks, are from standalone colleges. So from almost 9,900 students in Q4 2019, it was down to 2,182 students, representing a 78% drop for standalone ELICOS colleges. And for the student weeks, we actually saw a much steeper decline at 82% for this sector. Looking into detail, the top source country for the standalone colleges, ELICOS colleges, the drop in student numbers was reflected, of course, throughout its, as we can see here with the graph. So despite the 56% drop for Colombia, we can see here the increasing importance of this country for the sector. And this is shortly followed by China to 400 students for 2020. Brazil and Japan, South Korea, all faced a more than 80% drop quarter-on-quarter change. So Brazil from 291 in 2020, but it was previously 1,427 for the 2019 data. Moving on to university-based colleges. So we can see here the difference of the data from the standalone ELICOS colleges as university-based fared better for Q4 2020, both in student numbers and student weeks, with a 57% decrease in students, while for student weeks, a 55% decline. We can actually associate the better performance of university-based colleges compared to the ELICOS or to other sectors as well, as these sector has been providing, it actually reported the largest cohort of offshore students. So you can see here that they had the capability to offer this, and this is actually a different sector to be tapped. So for the university-based, we can see here China dominating the sector. So we can see here that China is not only important for the ELICOS sector itself, but also for the higher education, as we can see here being the top source country. So Japan, from 2019, with 1,028 students, it was down to 100 in 2020. And as mentioned previously, looking into detail into Japan, we have seen the drop because of the visitor visa, which is, it was composed of 85% in 2019 for university-based. For vocational and education training schools, comparing it to the standalone ELICOS colleges, it still fared better compared to the ELICOS and sector force decrease in 67.9 in student numbers. However, it showed a much steeper decline for the student weeks at 76.2. With its top source countries, we can see here the importance of Latin American countries, so Colombia and Brazil, for the vocational and educational training schools. Colombia and Brazil they remain the top source country despite their decreases of quarter-to-quarter change with 54% and 69% respectively. Moving on into the other sectors, so I'm going to briefly just go through multi-sector, the schools and private higher education. So with multi-sector, it saw a 62.1% drop in student numbers. So from 643, it dropped into 244. And for student weeks, it faced a 62.6% decline. For the school-based colleges, so we have here a steep decline as well, with 277 in 2019. It was down to 47 at 83. And it was also, the student weeks was also down at 79%. And lastly, for private higher education, we also saw a steep decline with 75% for student numbers and 69% for student weeks. Moving on to the new feature of the Q4 report, as we commit to providing new insights and areas for the sector. So we have gathered the data for the employee impact of the pandemic to sector. So this sheds light not only the effects of student numbers of the effects of pandemic to student numbers, but of course on the workforce employed by ELICOS colleges. So the results as shown here are based on 80 providers who were able to provide their data, and this reflects the status of employees as of December 31. So in general, colleges have adapted in various ways since the pandemic started and reported undergoing various measures to protect their employees. So they have been reducing working hours to staff leave requirements to adapt to the pandemic. So on the other hand, it's also important to note that when you were gathering the data, the numbers have also been, there has been challenges with the reporting, given the various organizational restructuring of colleges throughout the year. So as you can see here, full-time employees compose of 34.2% of the market of the sector, employee sector, and then for part-time 18.8% for employees in the ELICOS sector, and seasonal with the largest cohort at 46.9%. 37% reported to change to their working arrangements for full-time employees. However, 33% of these actually face a reduction in their working hours or salary. For part-time employees, 46% of these, quite high number, were released, while 36% actually saw a reduction in their working hours or salary. And looking at the seasonal employees, this was actually the most affected cohort, as 43% of this, this market was let go. Overall, 76% employees were affected by COVID-19, and the remaining, of course, were reported no change to working arrangements. And as an overall data, unfortunately, 37% of employees under ELICOS colleges have lost their jobs for 2020. This is across full-time, part-time, and seasonal employees. So going back to Brett, I'm passing on to my colleague here for the December 2020 data. So,
thank you very much, Svetlana. Again, some incredible insights from this Q4 survey results. I don't think we can underestimate some of the unique characteristics that have been generated by this survey process, and again, by the data that's been given to us from the colleagues that contributed, the 115 providers that volunteered their time to be able to submit this data. For me, just looking at those data sets that you've just presented, that trend in terms of students studying online, again, as we all know, online study is not a feature traditionally of our Australian ELICOS standards, and one that I think we had to make incredible transitions last year to be able to adapt into digital and remote learning modes. To see in that Q4 alone to have 52% of the student cohort, to the reported student cohort, studying online is quite amazing. Couple that with, I think, the other really significant insight to have 50%, so indeed half of the whole cohort of students studying ELICOS in Q4 were offshore. And once again, the representative group, given the number of providers that we've had respond to this survey, 115 colleges, and who they are in terms of their traditional student volumes, gives a really strong validity to it. So that in itself, taking away from the provider level and state level data, are two tremendously important high level insights from this research. I do want to note that when the provider level data, what we do is we follow a pattern which is similar to our annual ELICOS survey, and that course categorization or that provider categorization, it's based on whether the primary role of that college is to just teach English language for ELICOS only. And if it's a vocational college, it may be, or university or vet-based. So if it's a university-based college, it still may be a privately owned entity, but it's based and primary source of students would be in partnership with the university. So just qualifying, those are consistent metrics that we've used for a number of years in trying to give a better usability and granularity of the data and the insights that we get through these research projects to enable colleges from those similar types of entities to be able to compare like with like. But Svetlana, thank you for your in-depth insights. As noted, I will give a quick snapshot also of our student visa data, and this is to do with what we have in the system at the moment, published by Department of Home Affairs as at December 2020. And I guess in terms of segments, the first segment is what absolutely happened in terms of published Department of Education student visa commencements. Traditionally, around 30% of our ELICOS market is not in a student visa category, so our Q4 data picks up student numbers across those sample group. And now we're going to look at, again, student visa category for December for lodgements and grants. So this data doesn't include anyone that would have traditionally been in the visitor working holiday or other visa types. So just moving into that big picture of what's already happened in the visa system, so grants that are in the pipeline, but not yet translated into a commencement. Now, I do want to preface, when looking at this data, the primary visa will be the one that's recorded. So if a student's on a pathway from English to foundation or English to vocation to higher education, the higher education will be the primary course, and so they're captured within that visa category. And so for ELICOS, we have the independent ELICOS, as well as students that would be on a pathway into schools, vocational education, or into higher education across these different categories as well. Looking at that total picture of visa grants for 2020, what we've seen is that in the calendar year compared to 2019, a decline of 142,000 grants in 2020. So that's a 39% decline based on 2019. To put that into context, that decline is actually 3 times larger than the decline that was experienced back in 2010, which was the previous sort of benchmark decline, where we saw 43,500 grants, or 16%. So 2020 was 3 times larger declining grants than we've seen, in the past 10, if not many, many years before that. Almost half that decline was in higher education, and within that we've had offshore, so grants down in higher education of 35% or over 70,000, noting that ELICOS will be included within that pool. And that's a 13% drop onshore, but more significantly, we've seen the offshore grants declining by 47%. The vocational sector was the least impacted, with grants down by 24%, but that hides, I think, the real true nature of what's happened, because onshore only fell by 9%, but if you look at the offshore grant rate for vocational education compared to the prior year, it's actually down 75%. So that pipeline into vet, other than those onshore, was down 75% on the prior year. In schools, the school sector has fallen by 67%, and non-award had the most significant fall against prior year of 82%, and which most of that was offshore. an 83% decline in offshore into the non-award category. And again, important both in terms of study abroad, but that foundation program group that would traditionally come through in the non-award sector. Moving on to the independent ELICOS, and just to give a bit more context on the independent ELICOS sector, overall a decline of over 24,500. We saw a 63% decline in independent ELICOS. In that, I guess offshore grants again was most dramatic, down 73%, almost 74% in offshore, and down 28% onshore. Now, traditionally, our offshore market has made up 75% of the entire cohort, and so we need those new students renewing from offshore to keep the pipeline of commencements coming through. And that alone fell by 55% in grants over that period. What I would like to say, I guess, if we look at that on a month-to-month basis, which is shown here, the majority of our year-to-date growth, or what buffered the decline, was in those first 3 months up until March, when things were tracking quite well. But obviously the significant decline that happened post-April, when it pretty much stood to a standstill in 2020, and with very tiny numbers, as you can see, only 69 grants in the month of December alone. In that, I guess, if I look at the visa lodgements, overall, as mentioned, we've seen significant declines, both all sectors, but in independent ELICOS in that grants is a pretty negative picture. So just moving on that, I guess what we have on our next slide is independent ELICOS lodgements. So whilst lodgements were down, as I mentioned, overall by almost 37%, half of that up into higher education, which will include both ELICOS and other pathway students. But the independent ELICOS showed a decline of almost 65%. I know there's a lot of percentages, but I think coupled with what you're seeing on the screen, it's dramatic falls. And in terms of lodgements, these are lodged but not grants, having a 65% decline in the pipeline is going to have a long-term impact unless we can really pick up our game. Again, offshore, we saw the most dramatic impact in lodgements, and down 3/4 or 75% in lodgements. And just looking at that on a month-by-month picture on the next slide, what you'll see is, again, the January, February took up most of the volume of grants, or sorry, of lodgements that went into the system. And we were actually tracking slightly up, 2 to 3% up on prior year, until we hit that real standstill again from April moving forward. And month on month, lodgements between April to August were all literally 75. In terms of the offshore cohort, we've only been looking at around 75 lodgements per month. So some pretty scary sights, but just wanted to obviously let you know in terms of how we're tracking the performance, that there's certainly, people keep talking about our offshore demand and that what needs to come through. We really need to start turning on the taps in terms of getting those visas processed and ways in which we can give some assurity around students that if they lodge their visa, Australia is welcoming and accepting, and that we have an imminent date for them to come back as well. Moving forward, just in conscious, we'll get to the end. In fact, this one, I've just covered that slide off, so I'll go to the last slide, which is looking at essentially segmenting our visa lodgements by state. And New South Wales had the most, which is traditionally the most populous state for independent ELICOS. It suffered the largest decline in lodgements, and we saw 68% decline on prior year. Proportionally, New South Wales would traditionally take up about 50% of the market, so that impact of a 68% decline has had a significant impact overall. But looking at it even in terms of Queensland, down 65%, Victoria and WA equally, huge declines, with Victoria down 56% and WA down almost 50%, 49% compared to 2019. Won't labour that. We will give you that analysis again in our market report for the month. So just before we finish today's presentation, I'd like to just quickly acknowledge the support from Allianz Global Assistance, who I mentioned up front, our long-term supporter of our market intelligence and research. Wonderful service in terms of the support that they've provided to us. The type of services they've been providing throughout this period in terms of digital solutions have obviously been very, very critical and timely, the way in which they'll operate. A list of those telehealth and digital solutions are available to their member colleges or their providers, and they're happy to discuss alternatives with you. If you'd like to have a discussion, there is a list of key contacts on your screen now. Please follow up with any of those people, or English Australia, if we can put you in touch with someone from Allianz Global Assistance to talk about your needs from an OSHC perspective. That concludes today's presentation, but I did want to really, again, thank all of our participating institutions for your support and contributions to this survey, and indeed the last 3 surveys prior. Again, to the Department of Education, Skills and Employment, your support has enabled us to bring this survey out to the sector, so thank you. And to Bonnard for your wonderful support in undertaking the research and preparing the analysis and reports. For participating providers, the reports will be distributed this evening, as well as your pivot table. And as mentioned, we'll circulate in our English Australia monthly report tomorrow some of the analysis you've seen today on the student visa, and a link if you'd like to share the link from today's presentation as well. Thank you to everyone that's joined today's presentation. Please feel free to contact English Australia and me personally if there's anything you'd like to discuss out of today's presentation, and we look forward to bringing you more of this type of research into the future as well. That's all for today, so thank you for joining us.